Well, good morning. We'll probably go ahead and get started here. First and foremost, thank you so much, every one of you, for being here with us today to talk about something we all know to be incredibly important to the safety and security of our nation. My name is Ronal Serpas. I'm the founding chair of Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration. I'm also the former police superintendent in New Orleans, Louisiana, the police chief in Nashville, Tennessee, and the chief of the Washington State Patrol. During these last years, our group has worked now for 2 full years on trying to make some very straightforward points about reducing crime, reducing incarceration, and protecting our communities. I'm honored here to host today's National Law Enforcement Summit on Crime for 2017. On behalf of myself and my co-chairman, David Brown, retired police chief of Dallas, Texas, I'd like to thank our colleagues for traveling across the country to participate in this critical conversation. I also want to make a special note of thanks to Nicole Fortier and Inima Chahar, who worked so hard to help keep our group focused and moving forward. As we all know, our nation faces new challenges to public safety: an increase in opioid deaths and associated crime around that, an uptick in homicides in some cities, and in some cities we do have strained police-community relations. We gather at this summit today to discuss the best ways to address these challenges, drawing on strategies that have worked without turning to the misguided policies of the past. Our group, Law Enforcement Leaders, unites over 200 current and former police chiefs, prosecutors at the federal and state level, and police chiefs at the local, state, and county level, and sheriffs. Over these last 2 years, we've come together to articulate some 4 and 5 simple points of what we think can help reduce crime and incarceration simultaneously. I was a police officer for 34 years, and I know we can do this. I was a Comstat-era chief in the 1990s and the 2000s, and our metrics of measurements focused very heavily on arrest. And that's not to suggest that we didn't do good things. We know that crime is down by half since 1991. But we also know that we learned a lot during those 20 years or so of what could make a difference and make our communities more safe. All of us here today share the same passion. We're all law enforcement professionals, either as a police officer, a corrections official, a prosecutor, or anyone who is committed in the private sector or philanthropic sector to ensure safety in our communities. Together, the men and women in this room have dedicated their lives to performing those types of duties. We patrol our streets, we make cases in court, people are then found guilty if appropriate, and the prison system does the work that it can to make us safe and make them whole through recidivism, retention, and recidivism rehabilitation programs. But we also know police keep our streets safe not by putting more people in jail. The measure isn't how many people we can put in jail. The measure is that the right people are in jail, that the people we're afraid of are in jail, not the people that we're mad at, that the people who are in jail, more than half of them suffer mental health or alcohol and drug addiction problems. And we incarcerate them in the most expensive possible way with the least likely good result to come from that incarceration. And we have to remember, we have limited police officers, we have limited prosecutors, and we have limited prison beds. And those 3 things tell us that however we look at it, we have to prioritize the safety of our community and the safety of our officers. As progressive and conservative policymakers work to reform this criminal justice system in America and across the states, we've been fighting the crime fight on the line for decades. Everyone in this room has been in the front line of fighting crime over these last 10 to 15 years. And has been through that, we've learned some valuable lessons, and we hope to bring those lessons out. Today, you will hear from members of Congress, former attorney generals, prominent police chiefs, sheriffs, prosecutors, and the leaders of virtually every major law enforcement association. They will discuss why they are committed to the mission of reducing crime and incarceration at the same time, what they have been doing to advance that cause, and how we can move forward together. In all this, we must be able to rely on our government to support it. That's why the chairman, myself and Chief Brown, and the steering committee of our group sent a letter to President Trump and Attorney General Sessions this morning. In this letter, we're asking them to join this national bipartisan movement for criminal justice reform that has swept across the nation at not only the state level, but at the federal level. We are grateful as law enforcement professionals. Of course, we are grateful that the President has been steadfast in his support for the men and women in law enforcement. As the father-in-law of 2 active law enforcement officers, and my youngest daughter is a prosecutor in Orleans Parish, of course we are grateful that the leader of the nation supports law enforcement. Of course we are grateful for that. But that doesn't mean we can't have reasonable disagreements. That doesn't mean we can't bring forward perhaps another view, a view that has been born from the experience of 30 years of fighting crime. The unwavering support matters. The ability to use that support to articulate a message from law enforcement leaders who have been on the ground is what we hope to accomplish. Recent federal policy shifts seem to be possibly interpreted as moving away from some of the practices we've learned as police chiefs, as prosecutors, as corrections officials. We've come to learn that seeking the highest possible sentence for the lowest possible crime does not produce the maximum amount of safety. In fact, we've learned, I think many of us, that focusing narrowly with a laser attention on dangerous, violent offenders is what is going to do the most to help make our communities safer and make our officers safer, those who have to be on the front line at 2 o'clock in the morning making these decisions. Today, we respectfully request the administration join the bipartisan effort of criminal justice reform and align its policy agenda with that mission. I had my agenda here somewhere, but I'll make sure we get you one. We have 5 simple points we wrote in this letter today, the steering committee signed and we sent. The first one, ensure that federal funding to local police departments prioritize fighting violent crime without diffusing the focus with pushing low-level and non-level offenses. Second, we would request the government champion and sign into law federal sentencing reform, specifically the Bipartisan Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act, reintroduced just a couple weeks ago. Third, utilize mental health and drug treatment as the primary response to addiction. Fourth, bolster local community policing by increasing funds from the COPS office. Police officers cannot be successful. Prosecutors cannot be successful without a willing and supportive community that will play its role when it's time to prosecute a case, when it's time to have someone come into court and say under oath, yes, I saw that crime happen, and this is the person who's responsible. Community policing helps us close that gap. And lastly, expand reentry programs and rehabilitation programs so that those people who have served their time in jail have an opportunity to have a better life into the future. As a budding social scientist today, and as social scientists around the nation would confirm likely, when someone wants to be rehabilitated and you give them that opportunity, the rate at which they return to jail or prison drops dramatically. It's something we know can work. We believe these 5 policies will vastly enhance law enforcement's ability to fight crime effectively. This is our purpose. It's based on our experiences. Ultimately, police and prosecutorial practices must evolve to keep up with these new challenges. So must our criminal laws. To help formulate the next generation of crime policies, we must share with one another our concerns and success stories. This is the primary purpose of today's summit. Today we will hear from a distinguished group of police chiefs and prosecutors who have traveled all parts of the country to share their diverse stories. They will share with us the tremendous work they have done and are doing in their jurisdictions. These leaders are implementing new, innovative, and effective strategies that move us more towards fighting against violent crime without increasing unnecessary incarceration. We look forward to learning from their experiences. Criminal justice reform is one of the few areas where Republicans and Democrats have agreed. If we think about it for a moment, nearly 30 states in the Union have already passed criminal justice reform. And many of those states, which would be considered conservative states, if you will, have seen the duality: crime reduction, prison reduction, crime reduction, and prison reduction. It can happen. It's not a myth. It's not a superstition. It is happening, and it can happen. Criminal justice reform continues to be in a politicized environment. All of us who have been in law enforcement know what it's like to meet a victim who's been hurt and what their family feels and how that community and that neighborhood is hurt. But we can't let that be the guiding light. The guiding light has to be how to reduce it from happening in the first place, how to prioritize the work of our officers and prosecutors in the first place. Today we're going to hear from 2 distinguished speakers. The first speaker is Mark Holden, Senior Vice President and General Counsel of Koch Industries. From his position, Mark speaks with clarity and integrity about the urgent need to reform our criminal justice system as a moral, fiscal, and public safety issue. Mark has been a real voice in the field for years, sharing the facts about crime, and he and I have together written articles to be published. Op-eds is what they call it. It caught me right there, I forgot it. I've done pretty good for a guy from New Orleans all this time, right? Y'all have understood almost everything I've said. So together we have co-authored op-eds about the necessity of the fiscal need for criminal justice reform and the social imperative for justice reform. We will also hear today from former Attorney General Eric Holder. Attorney General Holder served as the 82nd Attorney General of the United States from 2009 to 2015 under President Obama. As the third longest serving Attorney General in the U.S. and the first African American to hold this office, he is an internationally recognized leader across a broad range of law enforcement and criminal justice issues. He has served in the government for more than 30 years, previously as an associate judge of the Superior Court of the District of Columbia, U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, and Deputy Attorney General for the United States Department of Justice. As Attorney General, he solidified his role as a leading progressive champion for the cause of ending over-incarceration. In 2012, the National Urban League honored him with their Living Legend Award for his commitment to ensuring equal justice for Americans. And in 2013, he instituted the historic Smart on Crime program. Many of our communities today are still working in the Smart on Crime initiative managed with and by the Justice Department. Both of our speakers are champions of justice. Both are dedicated and devoted to their careers. And we'll hear from Mr. Holden and then Mr. Holder, and I'll come back up to the stage. So thank you.
Good morning, Holden. I mean, always mixing us up, aren't they? Yeah. Hey, great to be here this morning. Thank you so much. Mark Holden with Koch Industries, here on behalf of Koch, and here on behalf of Charles Koch. And why are we interested in this issue? Well, Ronal laid it out pretty succinctly. It's a moral case, it's a constitutional case, it's a fiscal case. We are at Koch all about trying to remove barriers to opportunity. And we're also all about trying to make sure that government works smartly. And we don't think top-down approaches work real well. And if you look at our criminal justice system, particularly what's happened the last 30-plus years with the war on drugs, it's been a top-down approach that has probably done some good, but really overshot things. From the number of people that were swept up in the system that probably didn't need to be swept up in the system. And how do I have any cachet or ability to say that? Well, I grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts, and when I was in high school and college, the best job I ever had before I went to law school was as a prison guard. And it was there I caught up with a lot of kids I lost track of in junior high and high school. And if you haven't been to Worcester, you're lucky, probably, I don't know. But it's a great place, it's a working class town. And I grew up with kids, these people I grew up with were now in prison and incarcerated, largely due to drug crimes. They probably needed to be redirected for sure. But some of them, this is when I was 18, 19 years old, had already lost all hope, had no family support. And for me, it was one of those there before the grace of God go I moments. And what I saw was a situation where I think I was just lucky because I was a knucklehead and I didn't get caught and they did. Plus, I had parents that probably kept me in the straight and narrow and kept me out of trouble. And so for me, at a young age, it didn't make sense to me that low-level nonviolent offenders go to prison, and then once they're in prison, to survive, they usually become more violent, and when they get out, they can't get jobs. It didn't make sense at all. It was self-defeating. And so I'm very heartened by the fact that in the last 10 years, beginning with Hang 'em High, Deep Red State, Texas, they've started to reform their systems. And in Texas, they've now closed 8 prisons in the last 6 years, and their crime rates are at historic lows. And it's because of the same type of policies that we're going to talk about here today. And so there's a lot of things I could talk about in our system, how it's a two-tiered system. You know all this, but here's the most important thing for me, is that it's you all who are talking about this, law enforcement. Because in a lot of ways, you bear the brunt of the policy decisions we've made in the last 30 years. You've got to face it every day in these communities. Sometimes things get ugly, and you're on the front lines. So to the extent you believe this, which we do as well, that there's a way to keep communities safer without incarcerating low-level offenders, and you can reduce crime rates, and you can reduce incarceration rates, and importantly, reduce recidivism, which puts law enforcement at its greatest risk, keep communities safer, you can keep families together, and provide second chances for people. That's really good stuff. That's what we should be about in this country. And I think that what happened in the 80s was bipartisan and understandable. And in the 90s, it was bipartisan and understandable. We decided to treat everybody who was involved in drugs as if they were criminals, even though some of them didn't need to be dealt with that way. There's less consequential, more effective, less costly ways to deal with people who are mentally ill or who have a drug addiction or who are just poor and make bad choices about how they want to provide for their families than putting them in prison. And what I'd say is that looking back at the 80s and the 90s, really we made a lot of decisions based on fear and emotion. And fear and emotion is not a good way to make any decisions, whether it's personal, business-related, but definitely about taking away someone's freedom, particularly in a country like ours, where you look at the Bill of Rights, and at least 40% of it deals with criminal justice reform issues, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. So it should be a high bar for someone to lose their liberty in this country. And once they have paid their debt to society, they should be welcomed back. We aren't always doing those things, but the states have shown us how we can do it. And it's not based on fear and emotion. It's based on science, evidence, and database practices. And it involves keeping some people out of the system. It also involves those in the system, maybe not keeping them in law as long, but also potentially giving them programmatic activity, educational, vocational, spiritual treatment, whatever it is that ails them, so they come out better than they went in. So I'm very excited to be here today. And at this point, I don't have much else to say other than I'm really hopeful that the administration and the Department of Justice will listen to you all. We've had some really good meetings with the administration on these issues, criminal justice reform issues. But I think, again, that because you all put your life on the line and have dedicated yourselves to these communities that need the help and that have been most hurt by the war on drugs, that your voice matters the most. So I just want to say thank you as a number of family members in law enforcement and a bunch of my buddies in Worcester, Mass. in law enforcement. Thank you for all you do. And we owe this for you to get this right. So thanks very much.
Well, good morning. I want to thank the law enforcement leaders who are here today for their service that they have rendered to our nation and for the opportunity that you have given me to join with you at this very important event. I have a lot of old friends here. This is kind of an old home week for me. This is a good day. Your work and your policy views, I believe, have made this nation both more safe and more fair. You all deserve the appreciation of a grateful nation, and you have, and will always have, the continued support from this former Attorney General. Now, the nation must hear from your organization, the law enforcement leaders to reduce crime and incarceration, and particularly from your members, particularly from your chairman. I also want to thank my friends at the Brennan Center for being such an integral part of this very important effort. Now, I believe our country is at a crossroads. Will we heed the advice of seasoned law enforcement professionals? Will we base criminal justice policy on proven facts and accumulated evidence? Will we put in place policies that will actually make us safe and increase the necessary trust between communities and men and women in law enforcement who serve those communities? Or will we turn to the policies of the past that are not consistent with the needs of a 21st century America? Now, the answers from the executive branch in this capital city to the questions I've just posed, I find disappointing, dispiriting, and ultimately dangerous. This administration's unwise and ill-informed decision to reverse the progress being made in the criminal justice reform efforts begun in the recent past ignores, I think, a rare bipartisan political consensus that has formed around policing and sentencing reform efforts and will take this nation back to a discredited past. In removing, for example, the discretion vested in the men and women of the Department of Justice to seek justice for the unique circumstances that each case presents, this administration has reversed or has revealed its lack of faith in their judgment as well as their integrity. And by encouraging local police to divert resources towards nonviolent crimes and urging federal prosecutors to seek higher sentences in all cases, I think we run the risk of igniting another drug war that will fill our jails, but not necessarily make our streets safer. There exists, we know, a different and more intelligent way. The administration policies announced to date are not tough on crime. They are not smart on crime. And contrary to what has been said, they are not universally and unequivocally supported by the law enforcement community. They are, I believe, and it almost pains me to say this, but they are ideologically motivated, and I think represent a cookie-cutter approach that has only been proven to generate unfair and unneeded harsh sentences that are often applied indiscriminately and do little to achieve long-term public safety. People most directly involved in law enforcement, you all, police and prosecutors, have today sent a letter to the administration urging it to refocus its efforts on the reform agenda that was proven to work. Now, the Justice Department's own data from just last year revealed that since the Smart on Crime policies were put in place in 2013, prosecutors have used the discretion that they were given to focus on more serious drug cases. The data showed that while they brought fewer indictments carrying a mandatory minimum sentence, the prosecutions of high-level drug defendants and those who committed drug crimes with a weapon had risen, while cooperation and plea rates remained effectively the same. Now, the data does not show that the nation as a whole is in the midst of an unprecedented crime wave. Yes, crime must be treated, I believe, as a recurring virus that cannot be ignored. But claims cannot be made that are unsubstantiated and policy then based on those claims. Crime remains at close to 40-year lows. Although there has been an uptick in the national crime statistics the past 2 years, the increase is neither substantial nor apparently lasting. The crime rate for 2017 is down so far, and if trends continue, this could be among the safest years the nation as a whole has seen. Now, the observed uptick in crime in 2015 and 2016 can largely be traced to increases in a few jurisdictions and do not reflect a truly national trend. Every city and every neighborhood must be made safe. And in this regard, we must deal with the opioid crisis that robs us of promising lives and endangers our neighborhoods. But the approach we take in this effort should not be a repeat of how we confronted the crack epidemic 2 decades ago, where we only employed a law enforcement option and ignored the public health issues that were intertwined with the criminality that had to be addressed. So yes, today we must incapacitate and incarcerate those who sell opioids, and especially those who engage in violent acts in doing so. But we must not forget the public health component to the problem. Drug and mental health treatment must be a significant part of the enforcement effort. This is what criminal justice reform looks like. And we must remember that as recently as 2014, and as a result of the reform efforts at the national and state levels, both crime and incarceration rates fell together for the first time in 40 years. Now, there will be surely year-to-year fluctuations in the statistics, but if we examine the crime rates from the early 1990s to the present, there is a fairly consistent and dramatic downward trend. Now, abandoning this evidence-based progress and turning back the clock to an instinctive, discredited, ideologically motivated policy also threatens the financial stability of the federal criminal justice system as well as systems in our states. These reversals will be both substantively and financially ruinous, setting the Department of Justice back on a track to again spend 1/3 of its budget on incarcerating people rather than preventing, detecting, or investigating crime. The United States, I mean, you all know this, has about 5% of the world's population and roughly 25% of the entire world's prisoners. and yet we are far from the safest nation. Under the policies announced by the administration to date, the money spent solely on incarceration would rise and lessen the ability of the Justice Department to hire prosecutors, to hire agents, and significantly to make grants to its state and local partners. Now, we must also address an issue that has proven to be extremely divisive and that I believe has been sadly exploited for political gain. The notion that there is a tension between fair, respectful enforcement of our laws and the safety of those who risk so much in service to us all is simply not accurate. Trust is not now at a level that is needed between some in communities of color and some in law enforcement. We must face this difficult truth, and we must recognize that there are answers to this problem. Police officers must be given the best equipment and taught the most effective self-protection techniques. They must also get the best training in the use of force and alternatives to it that decrease the number of questionable fatal encounters while not increasing the danger to the involved officer. Community efforts to understand the difficulty and the stress of being on the beat must also substantially increase. Finally, and too frequently resisted, more widespread understanding of implicit bias and the impact it has on perceptions and decision-making must be a part of any effort to make better police-community relations. Now, I'm very concerned that these practical approaches that have proven to work and which were growing in acceptance have been abandoned to create a political wedge issue that in the long term makes police officers less safe. These political policy reversals only exacerbate tensions. They do not relieve them, and those in law enforcement to whom we all owe so much are used as pawns in a political chess game that has real-world consequences. Now, this general and, from my perspective, illogical administration reversal is driven by voices who have not only been discredited, but until now have been relegated to the fringes of this debate. Congress can reverse these actions by enacting the criminal justice reform measures that were being considered as late as last year and that had the support of Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and progressives. And I salute those in elected positions who have had the courage to challenge that which is politically safe but nationally unwise. But expressions of support are not now enough. Now is the time for long overdue legislative action. Congress should pass the reform measures that it has before it and place this nation on a path to safety, fiscal responsibility, and the building of trust between law enforcement and the people it serves. It should do so quickly and ensure that criminal justice policy is designed for 21st century realities and not beholden to a failed 20th century ideology. We have the ability and the possibility to create a criminal justice system that protects the American people in a manner that is efficient and fair and is consistent with our founding ideals. We must not squander this opportunity. Now, I am confident, I'm optimistic that an informed American people, when given the real facts, will not only support proven reform efforts, they will demand them. I am truly optimistic, and I look forward to working with all of you in creating the environment in which the positive transformation that is so sorely needed can be made real. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Holden, Attorney General Holder. We're going to transition the room here so that our panel can come up. And as we seek that moment to clean up the room and the transition, we should always remember this. Every single member of the law enforcement community and the law enforcement leaders have been lifelong crime fighters, have been lifelong committed to solving crimes and helping neighborhoods be safe. There's no one in this room who's ever been soft on crime. And from that, I think we have a lot of voice to give.